Here's Ravi Zacharias to give some cliched answers to an atheist's question.
Hello, my name is Ethan Kaiser. I am a scientist and an atheist, and my question is, since the Bible has been scientifically disproven as far as all the claims, through evolution, the theory of evolution, archaeology, Noah's Ark, Adam and Eve, since we know this didn't happen because of our science nowadays, my question is, how do we have, according to the Bible, how do we have free will if God is this omniscient being that knows everything about us, everything we will do, and he pretty much knows our outcome before we're even created? So he creates us knowing everything we'll do. Since we can't surprise him by our actions, we have no free will. Our choices have been predetermined, and that the act of judgment is completely immoral because he knows what we're going to do. Nothing can surprise him.
Not only that, he knew everything that we were going to do before he created us, but he decided to create us anyway. If he exists, he even created those of us who will end up in hell, knowing that we will end up in hell. He could have abstained from creating those of us who were destined for hell, but he decided to do so anyway.
That's my question.
Thank you for the question, and before you go into an auditorium, if you give a sheet of paper and ask us to write 20 possible questions, that'll come. We've never heard a new one in all of these years that go by. They're pretty much the same questions. It's interesting that you began by saying, as an atheist, all of this has been disproved, and so you live with scientific materialism as your worldview.
Well, he said specifically that Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark have been disproved. Find me a scientist that believes otherwise.
I studied under John Polkinghorne at Cambridge University. You probably know the name. One of the world's leading quantum physicists who came to exactly the opposite conclusion you did while being the dean at Queen's College, Cambridge, as a quantum physicist, taking the same data you did. So obviously, for a man of his intellectual ability to come to a different conclusion, one would either have to say he's totally stupid to come to that conclusion.
Unless he came to the conclusion that Adam and Eve existed or Noah's flood really happened, he did not come to the opposite conclusion of the guy in the audience.
Or else his empirical basis. Please don't keep shaking your head. Let me finish so that you can come and talk afterwards. So allow us to concentrate what we are saying here. I want to read for you what David Berlinski says about the scientific naturalistic worldview. Do you know who he is? One of the world's leading physicists who is an agnostic, borders on atheism, but took issue with Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, and wrote a book called The Devil's Delusion. Here's what he said. Has anyone ever provided proof for God's inexistence? Not even close.
What does that have to do with the guy's question about how judgment can be moral if God knows everything we will do? And if you want a proof that God doesn't exist, I'll give you one. The universe is the space-time continuum. Whenever there is time, there is the universe. You can't create something at a time when it already exists, and since there, by definition, was never a time when the universe didn't already exist, and it would be a contradiction to speak of anything existing or happening before time exists, the universe cannot coherently have been created or had a creator. If you define God as the creator of the universe, then God, therefore, cannot coherently exist.
Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close.
It's here because it has always been here. If there was a time when it didn't exist followed by a time when it did, it would make sense to wonder what caused that change. Since no such change took place, what is there to explain? To ask why the universe exists instead of not existing is to make the baseless assumption that the default state of reality is nothingness and that existence requires explanation. There's no reason at all to believe this.
Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close.
The idea that life could not exist in a universe with even slightly different parameters could only be true if there is no God. If an all-powerful God exists, he would have the power to put life into a universe with any set of constants. He wouldn't need to finely tune it. In fact, if we lived in a universe with constants and parameters that made the natural development of life impossible, that would be proof that life is not a merely natural phenomenon. A lack of any supposed fine-tuning would be better evidence of an all-powerful being.
This is Berlinski talking. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything as long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism and moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough.
How has God given us an understanding of what is good, right, and moral? Theistic morality tends to simply say that something is good because God says it is. What objective, non-circular justification is there for that?
Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close.
How do you figure?
Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough.
What's your evidence of that exactly?
Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark.
Since God is often defined as existing timelessly and spacelessly, belief in his existence is irrational. To exist means to have location in space-time. It is therefore a contradiction to say that anything exists timelessly and spacelessly. Believing in a contradiction is about as irrational as you can get. The idea that the universe was created or had a creator is logically nonsensical. Believing in that is irrational too.
Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on.
Simply not being convinced that a God exists is not an exercise in contempt for those who do believe in a God.
Now, I didn't say that, all right? I'm not quoting myself. Please give me your name, sir. Ethan?
Yes.
Ethan, what you're wrestling with is not uncommon. Many people from a scientific and materialistic worldview will say what you've said and come to that conclusion.
Even if a person did not have a materialist worldview, they could still come to the conclusion that knowingly creating people who will inescapably end up in hell is hard to square with the idea that the Creator is a loving being.
The problem is what you mispositioned was your concern between determinism and free will.
Let's say that somehow God can infallibly know everything that a person will do while that person retains free will. Even then, if he infallibly knows that a person will definitely use their free will in such a way that results in them going to hell, even before that person is conceived, why would he create them in the first place? Why would a loving God create a being who he knows will inescapably end up in hell?
Your application could have gone in many different directions, but you came to that one for some reason, which I was unfortunate, I think. At Cambridge, I listened to a talk at the Lady Mitchell Hall in 1990 by Stephen Hawking. As you know, he can't speak, he uses a speech synthesizer. His whole talk was on determinism and freedom. And you know what he concluded? That the tragedy with scientific materialism, if we take its assumptions, is that we are not free, we are totally determined.
No, that's not the conclusion of scientific materialism. Not everything that matter does is deterministic. Purely physical phenomena still have some degree of spontaneity sometimes. Materialism does not entail determinism. I believe that the decision-making process is deterministic because I don't see any convincing evidence that anything spontaneous is happening in the brain that could have consequences for cognition. But there are spontaneous events that are nonetheless purely physical. Even if we do have free will, its existence could be entirely compatible with materialism.
That was the world's leading physicist at that time saying, the very thing you're asking of the Christian faith, he pinned on your backs.
The difference is that even though everything we do is predetermined, we don't know what we are predetermined to do, so we don't create people whom we infallibly know to be destined for eternal misery. God, if he exists, does.
As scientific materialists, you can go right online and trace it. Lady Mitchell Hall, 1990, somewhere around March, April, May, that time I was in attendance. And he said, the only escape I have is since I don't know what has been determined, I may as well not be.
With respect to the moral implications, that's entirely correct. If I were to have a child, there's no way I could know if that child were going to have a happy life or not. But if I could infallibly know that if I had a child, that child would inevitably end up miserable, it would be pretty sadistic to go ahead and conceive that child anyway, don't you think?
The whole auditorium moaned and groaned with an escape hatch that he gave for himself after telling us that we were completely determined. That's Berlinski's issue. That is actually even what people like Dawkins will concede, or Pinker, you read Steven Pinker and the others, so totally determined. So the question is, were you free to ask this question?
Why would that matter? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.